Hey guys, I'm Rooter, and today I'll be helping you guys make your own VTuber model. So if you're interested in doing fun animations such as this, I would definitely recommend this guide. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So starting with the sketching phase, the first thing I would recommend is using a large canvas. The one I use is 2160 by 4096. You could go larger, but this is just the one I prefer to work with. Another thing I would recommend is when you're sketching your model to keep the pose of your VTuber to be symmetrical. It just allows for greater movement and it's easier on yourself that way. Otherwise, yeah, this is just the sketching phase, so I'll speed on through this and get to the line art part. I just wanted to jump in real quick to say that I also added in another layer, in fact, multiple layers for different emotes I had in mind that I wanted to add. So just make sure to keep that in mind. You should probably also sketch extra stuff that you may need for emotes. You don't need to think too far ahead, like how many parts you need, etc. Just sketch what you want them to look like in general. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is taking all my sketches and putting them into their own sketch folder. And for every new part I'll be working on, I'll make a respective folder for them. Something to keep in mind when doing this is that when naming your files and your layers, I would definitely strongly recommend to label everything except for the sketches. But when you rename something, don't put any spaces in it, as Live2D doesn't like it and it will rename it for you, which is bad because you won't know what the piece is. So I strongly recommend renaming every single piece and making folders for everything. So the pen I use is the G pen, and I typically use a size 4 for it. Something that I do when I separate and cut my pieces is that I actually prefer to draw each piece separately instead of drawing everything on one layer and cutting it. It's up to your preference and your art style. It's just easier for me to keep my art style that way, so it all depends on you. So I didn't want to leave you guys hanging, so here's an example on how I actually separate the pieces, and we'll be looking at Usabi's side-swept hair as an example. So as you can see, it looks like it's one piece on top of another piece, right? And it's an easy example too, I admit, but it's just how I think of it. So you can think of it in the two extremes, for example. So you can put that entire hair swept, the side swept, into one piece, or you can separate it into its 5 pieces. Now the problem with putting everything into one piece is that it's going to end up looking almost flat and static, and the problem with 5 pieces is that is a lot to rig, and you're gonna need to, put a lot more effort into, a side sweep, when you could make it just 2 separate pieces, so you get that good amount of not too flowy, but flowy enough that it looks realistic. So I would separate it into 2 pieces. Now there's nothing wrong with having more pieces, obviously. It's better to have more than less, in my opinion. But the problem with more is that you need to therefore put more work into it to make it look good. Otherwise, it could actually look worse, arguably, than if you just had it set as one entire piece. So you need to also gauge how much detail you want to put into it, and it may seem simple, like, oh, just separate everything, but the thing is, there are instances where you may not even know that you can separate a piece. So I'll be speeding on ahead to another example where this is something that you would probably want to separate, that you wouldn't even realize you should separate. So let's get there. So right here, I'm drawing the back of the head for Usabi's model. And the reason why I'm drawing that is because for the different perspectives and the range of motions Usabi's model is going to have, and just in general for all the models that I make, normally you can see the top of the back of the head, kind of. So I would recommend for you to do that as well, because most Live2D models have a separate layer for that, from the front of the head, the back of the head, and some people even have a middle part of the head. I don't do that, but it's definitely I would personally recommend doing that, just because it's technically less of a hassle, but I didn't do that here. But I would recommend you do that. So here I'm working on Usabi's model, and this part is the belt portion of her model. And something that I regret how I separated this piece was that I didn't separate the bag enough. So it made it harder to model the bag in a 3D space, and that's something you have to keep in mind. I would recommend imagining the shapes simple shapes. You know what I mean? It just makes it easier to see the perspective. That's something you'll need to have a good grasp of perspective when it comes to making Live2D models. So I would definitely recommend thinking about it in simplified shapes, even drawing it out if you have to, just to understand it. But you can always go back and add more pieces or edit the model, so you don't need to stress too hard. But it's best to reduce as many changes as you can prior to starting to rake the model, just because some funky stuff can happen in there. But otherwise, this is how I would split it now, and this is how I split it during the stream. So right here, I'm drawing the leg, and what I would do is I separate it into 3 pieces. It's going to be the thighs, the rest of the leg, and then the feet. And when you're drawing these 3 separate parts, what I want you to do, if you choose to draw your legs in this way, is to make sure there's an overlap where the thigh and the leg meet, and where the leg and the feet meet. And we'll be using glue in Live2D to fix it all up. The thing I described about the thighs, you're gonna do the same thing for the arms, where I separated into the upper arm, the forearm, and the hands. And how I had it set was the upper arm, it's going to overlap with the shoulder part in a sense, that part where it connects, with your neck. The shoulder part and the elbow, and then your forearm is gonna connect at the elbow and the hand, and then the hand just has an overlap with the forearm. And you're gonna do that with both arms. So after you finish all your line art, you're gonna get to the coloring phase, and here I'm gonna show you an example of how to color something in a certain way so that when you go in and animate it, you can get some cool, nice 3D effects. So here, what I'm doing normally is coloring in the head, but what I'm doing is I'm actually making another layer for the outline specifically and coloring that as well. And what I'm doing is laying one over top the other. And the reason you do this is because when you turn your head in a certain angle, you'll be able to make your head almost blend in with the neck in a sense. And that looks really nice for some people, So you can do that. It doesn't just apply with the head. You can do that with basically any part. But something you need to keep in mind if you do that is that that's gonna be a lot of rigging to do. It's gonna increase your file size for the art and for your model. So your models, if you're going to have a lot of animations in your model, I would not recommend being super fancy, maybe just limiting it to the head and a couple other parts, because it can get super intensive and not saying it'll blow up your device or anything, but It'll be a very, very heavy model. So if you noticed, up until this point, I haven't mentioned the eyes, the mouth, or the face in general, and that's because, in my opinion, it's the hardest part to draw and animate. So instead of trying to just explain it to you, I'm gonna just throw on screen how I separate the layers. You can follow this guide or another guide, but generally, most Live2D artists tend to separate them this way. You can simplify it if that's what you're going for, but if you want a nice 3D effect, I would definitely recommend splitting it this way or splitting it with more layers. Alright, so we're at the end of this video and also nearing the end of this section of the tutorial. If you've been following along, what we've basically done is we made the sketch of our VTuber, we did line art for the VTuber, we colored in the pieces for the VTuber, and we did it all in a manner so that each piece was basically already separated as we were drawing with them. So you should have a whole complete model with all the parts separated and stuff. Make sure you've done this for the emotes too. So all you really need to do after you have your basically finished art of your VTuber is to save the file as a .psd. Don't save it as a big Photoshop document or whatever other variations there are, because Live2D only accepts .psd currently. So in the next tutorial, what we'll be doing is looking into rigging, and that will be a lot more vigorous and much more experimental. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial so far. I try to add in a lot of graphics to make it easier to grasp and understand. In the description, I'll try and add some more resources if you prefer just looking at still images. And I also tried cutting up the YouTube bar so that you can navigate it more easily. If you guys have any criticism or comments or anything you want to let me know, feel free to comment it down below. And if you appreciated the video, go ahead and give me a like. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next part of the tutorial.